welcome everybody to the monthly meeting of the SMPTE Rocky Mountain section and SBE48. We try to come up with interesting topics every month, and we're thrilled to have everybody joining us this month for our esteemed panel that will be discussing microservices and media, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And there's plenty of all three, well, I assure you. So let me first introduce our panelists. And first of all, thank you not only to everybody who joined, but to our panelists for agreeing to bat around this subject for the next 45 minutes or so in as entertaining a way as we possibly can. So our panelists today, we have Ankur Jain from Prime Focus. Hi, Ankur. We have Shawn Maynard of Florical Systems. Thanks for joining us, Shawn. We have Wes Rosenberg of Levels Beyond joining us from the Left Hand Brewing Company. We're all jealous. We have Mike Strein of Disney Television.
Hi there.
And Sujay Kumar. Sujay.
Hello, everyone.
Thanks for being with us. All right. So let's get this rolling. And I'm gonna toss a softball to our panelists to begin with. And by the way, if people have any comments or questions, the beauty of having this on Zoom and having a panel here is that we can certainly make this as interactive as you like. So if you would like to jump in at any point, if you can get a word in edgewise with our panel, you're more than welcome to either kind of wave your hands, try to get our attention, or if you want to put something up in the chat window, we'll cue you at the appropriate point. So don't feel like you need to just sit there and listen to us talk about what we think is important. If you think something's important, we'd love to hear from you too. So to kick things off, I'm not sure what the level of familiarity is of our audience in general around microservices, but it seemed like a good place to start, since we're talking about microservices and media, is what the heck do we even mean when we say something's a microservice? So I'm going to throw that out to the panelists. Who wants to tackle that?
Oh, can I start with my joke? I'll start with the joke.
Yeah.
So a microservice is like humor. If you have to explain what it does, it's bad.
Ooh. Very good. Very good.
Are we going to rate these jokes, or
He's here all night. Try the roast beef.
I know he's got a couple of them, but
There's more to come.
Well, since we started with a joke, I'll throw my joke in that I coined earlier. Was that a microservice walks into a bar. He was looking for a job. I'm here all night.
That's not bad, actually.
Yeah.
Oh.
Okay, but seriously, who wants to take a kick at what do you think a microservice is, guys?
So why don't I go with my attempt on this, Chris? So yeah, I mean, when you look at a certain set of services or applications or smaller applications which are organized towards a business need, right? When you're trying to solve a specific business need, but these are smaller sort of applications or services, you can term it as microservices, right? So it's as simple as that and as complicated as that. And through this discussion, we will know what we mean by how simple this is. Like, you can put something, replace an application, try to get an output in the way you want. But to build it, to manage it is a whole different ballgame. That's the complexity part of it. But yeah. That's how I would start.
Yeah, I think it's funny because microservice doesn't mean that it's small. right? I would used to joke that if it had more than 10,000 lines, it was a milliservice or a nanoservice. It was no longer micro. But it's more about business context and business function than size, right? It does one thing. That's it.
I like it. Any other stabs at what a microservice is, guys?
Well, some examples. It's a microservice is the guy who chops the wood. Another microservice is a guy who picks up the wood. Another microservice is a guy who stacks the wood. You know, that's microservice. It has nothing to do with wood, by the way. You know, I don't want to confuse anybody. It's like, wait a minute. I thought we were talking about cloud computing.
Replace the wood with content, and you've got it.
That's right. That's right.
Go. Exactly. So I guess we have at least a basic understanding of what microservices are. And since we're all in the media business here in one form or another, let's talk about how these can apply to the media business in general. And why does this even matter? Why is this important? How can these be used to hopefully make our lives easier?
Yeah, if I can go, so I think let's look at some of those statistics, right? I mean, if you do not have to go very far, just look at our friends from IIBM. I mean, if you look at some of these statistics, right? I think close to 40% of the organizations in the context of today, right, where we are trying to define the new normal of who we are and what we are, they have already accelerated their move to the cloud, right? And the other interesting the factor is that roughly, I would say 60%, if you look at the combination of folks who have already moved to the cloud or are in the process of moving to the cloud or likely will invest in cloud, they're all looking at microservices as a mechanisms to basically either re-architect or completely look at building cloud native applications. So I think this is very innovative. Okay, so this is a very important thing. The other thing which we need to understand is in the concept of today, the whole broadcasting is getting decentralized, which essentially means that you're going to be more remote, and which also means that a large proportion of software-defined everything is going to play a very critical role. And the moment you're getting into that kind of an environment, your ability to rely on a monolithic set of applications to drive your workflow is going to be next to impossible, because you're going to see a constant churn in the hardware. Hardwares are becoming either commoditized or more intelligent, right? And which also means that a lot of these companies are in the process of churning out or releasing some of the software life cycles a lot faster than it used to happen before. So I think some of those driving factors will propel adoption of microservices to a very significant, I would say, scale in the given future.
Chris, I'll add something to that. If you're building a facility now, you're not just taking dedicated hardware, connecting it together. You're putting in a number of, whether it's boxes or software services that need to talk to one another. And as Sujay just said, this is a software-defined environment. So how do all these things talk together, pass information back and forth, pass media back and forth, pass metadata back and forth, and accomplish the goal of what you want to do in your content creation business, whether that's real time, over the top, file-based, whatever it is. These devices need to talk to one another, and they talk both.
You want to eat now while it's hot?
Oh yeah, eat now while it's hot.
Oh, absolutely.
but they talk both in an east-west manner, between themselves, and north-south to bring things back up and top. So it's almost like you're creating a software-defined stack environment in all this.
If I can just go back and do a little 101, right? the reason why we're talking about microservices is that cloud computing is a technology platform. And the way you architect in that environment is with microservices. That's inherent to the cloud computing platform. And the reason why that makes a difference is that when we talk about monolithic software, that's the way applications needed to be built on those OS platforms. And in order to have a working, software engineered properly. But when I take, let's say, a Dell machine and I load it with software to do a certain task, it's monolithic. But what I did is bought 100% of the computer. But I may only use in a operating environment, I may only use 10, 20, maybe 30% of the resources of that box, right? So even, whether it's the CPU, whether it's the GPU, whether it's memory, I'm using a certain percentage, but yet I paid for 100%. The beauty about cloud computing as a technology platform is that it is somewhat getting rid of your car and going with Uber. I use only, I pay for only what I use. So if I'm only using 30% of the resources, that's all I'm paying for, rather than paying for 100% and only using 30. So as a technology platform, it makes a lot of sense. The other benefits is that it's very agile and decentralized. So, for a software development company, I can create my widget once, put it out there in one spot, and when I want to update it, I update that one spot, and it's good for everybody. Everybody gets the update. Whereas in a platform-centric environment or OS environment, I've got to update that thing 1,000, 1,000,000 times, depending on use case, which can be an absolute nightmare because you have a lot of fragmentation all over with different versionings. And this allows a company to be able to create from one platform a version that's used across all the users, and that's fantastic. It's a better platform, technology platform, and it's the right evolution.
And I would actually expand on what you were saying, Shawn, about underutilizing the resources that you've got. One of the big things that we face in the media business now is what happens when you need to scale beyond 100%, because we have to create more versions of everything. We have to deliver to more platforms, that sort of thing. So, you had the 100%, and that's all you could ever do in the past.
Exactly.
Whereas with microservices, you could go up to, theoretically, the sky's the limit, right, in terms of resources.
Yeah.
And Chris, just to add to that, right? I mean, in the media business today, innovation is such a demanding thing. Like everybody needs to innovate, right? I mean, people didn't get time to react to COVID, but people just had a few months to react to it and come up with something new. So if innovation is the key, and that's what the business needs to support, then there are things like how quickly can you bring the solution to the market? In the monolithic architectures, your cost to fail was too high. I mean, if you fail, the whole thing comes down. Here, you could experiment, like you said. You're going to the cloud. You're trying to use optimally your hardwares. You're trying to bring in something new, so you can quickly test, experiment, and fail without bringing the whole system down. Right? Only a piece fails there. And I believe there is with the cloud framework coming in, there has to be a very new definition to the word reliability, because reliability doesn't mean that you cannot fail, right? Reliability means that how quickly can you recover when you fail, right? And I think that's a way of looking at this. And I feel that microservices sort of answers this in a much better way than the monolithic architectures of the past. So So yeah, now there are different definitions. So the failure rate changes are different now, and I feel that reliability and the velocity to bring this product to the market, to constantly address business need, right? That's the need of the hour, and this kind of services, microservices, enable this to be achieved.
Yeah, is it fair to say that there's a whole set of advantages on the vendor side, right? From being able to, as Shawn said, be able to deploy things out, maintenance, agility, that sort of thing. There's this whole set of advantages from that side. But if I go back to Mike from like an ABC News perspective, what's the attraction here? It's like, okay, this is great for your vendors. How is this great for ABC News?
Well, it's not great until it becomes somewhat standardized, and I think that's a key thing. If you look, the technical people you have in facilities have to evolve, and now you're going to have people that are, aware and know how to do and how to operate in this type of software-defined environment, right? So, how do you work with microservices? If they become standardized, you can work on this in this sort of environment and do this sort of thing. So, we all have to change, I think, and not just the content providers and the people that have facilities, but the integration companies as well, who deploy this sort of stuff. You just can't rely on, in the past, you relied on a couple of days of commissioning when you bought a product, typically a monolithic product. The vendor gave you a couple of days of commissioning, they put in your workflow, and that was it. Workflows change constantly now. Someone mentioned COVID just before. Everybody had to completely adapt their workflows. How do you do that? Microservice type environment, and you can do that, provided you have the right people to go and make the changes that you need to do. But now this now gives the capability down. It pushes the capability down so that you can create those workflows yourself. At least that's the promise. If it's not standardized such that you have to create a different one for each, application you're stitching together, then it becomes problematic.
And if I may add to what Mike mentioned, and a good question from your side, Chris. So if we look at the SMPTE-2110 standard, for example, right? And it took like time to build such kind of standard, which was supposed to be adapted across all the different, both the consumers of the standard as well as the providers of this services, right? And when you look at the challenge is that, because these softwares are getting released so fast, that the ability of the service providers to even adhere to some of these standards takes a beating. I mean, because they are focused on trying to design their own data exchange or control interfaces. So microservices allows in that case to kind of bring in some sort of a, if I can use the word, soothing factor to ensure that both on the consumption side of services, or let's say, or on the provider side who is actually contributing, it makes it a lot more easier to kind of build services and have some sort of interconnectivity. Otherwise, it becomes a huge challenge because there's so much of disparity in the systems.
There's also on the development side, Chris, that I think is interesting. So as a software development company, our customers have been dependent on that all pieces within our software are coherent, work well together, and they function to create an application that does its job. But in a microservices environment, you're not dependent on the single company being great at building every one of the pieces of the architecture that makes up the application, right? Because if there are usable pieces out there that's been used in other environments, going back to the wood chopper example, what if company B is really great at stacking wood? Company A is really great at cutting wood. Well, you now in this cloud computing environment, I can actually get those two to work together. So I don't have to just depend on one vendor to architect a solution for me. I can actually create the best of breed across multiple different providers to create an excellent workflow product.
Yeah, and I'm liking your wood analogy here, Shawn.
I just had to pull something out there that people can,
That's
get a hold
good.
of.
But and if we were to even extend that, you're not just talking cross-vendor compatibility, interoperability, right? If you said that, maybe the guy who cuts it needs to work in on a particular platform. It's his sawmill, right? He's got
That's
this
right.
sawmill that he's invested in, and it does all this kind of stuff. But you only want to use his cutting capabilities, and so but you want to use again somebody else has a different yard where they do the stacking and that sort of thing. So you can talk about extending this to multiple platforms. And if you think about it from the perspective of you don't just need the vendors to work together, you need to be able to run. Maybe vendor A likes to run in AWS, vendor B likes to run in Google, vendor C likes to run in Azure. So but the analogy kind of fits that because you like you may be stuck with the the platform that he's on. That your allegiance to him implies an allegiance to a platform, and it also implies that you better be able to run this stuff cross-platform. So,
Yeah, I think that opens up
Yeah,
another can of worms.
I'm going to continue the wood analogy because, like, just the guy who's cutting wood, the power from one of the powers of microservices and the abstraction of the guy who cuts wood is that there may be a guy who cuts maple really well using one table saw and another guy who cuts oak really well using another saw. And I can abstract that out and say, today I've got oak, tomorrow I've got maple, and send my steps and functions to two different places, right? Depending on what I need to do.
yeah,
And I think we've seen this at work with a number of development that's starting out there, especially in the realm of ML, right? Because a lot of these cloud computing, public cloud platforms have already their own ML that you can utilize. So then it's just, just like all software development, it's inputs and outputs, right? So, what does this service do? Well, it has an input and it has an expected output. And so now I don't have to build my own ML. If the platform that I'm building some services on has a great ML and has, ML is only as good as your database of things that you've already collected to test against. So if I have one of the public cloud platforms that's already done great ML work, I can just use that service to complement what I'm doing in my entire workflow. And that's okay in that environment, rather than in our current OS platform environment, I have to build the entire thing.
right.
And Chris, to your point, whether it's vendors versus customers, this is classical you, right? You always want to bring in those two perspectives. But look, I mean, coming from the vendor's side, right, we always try to solve for customers' business requirements and look at it from a customer side. Like, I'm sure Mike would be happier to have choices of vendors for the same business objective which he's trying to solve, because he doesn't want to get locked in with 5 years of contracts which are huge, difficult to get out, and no matter what, you have to live and die with that particular piece of code and that particular architecture, right? So that, I think that that flexibility has to go back to the customer. That choice has to go back to the customer. More importantly, when that is gone back to the customer, the vendors have to innovate, because now that the same service can become more replaceable. My entry barrier is gone. Somebody else can come in fairly quickly. So at the vendor side, at our side, we have to innovate, and hence we have to also adopt it much faster, right? So now, coming from what I'm thinking, that we started with MAM, then we moved to production cloud. Now we are in the distribution side of the business, right? And that was only because we had to constantly innovate. First, we were trying to solve an issue of, the world was moving from tapes to files, right? So how do you manage the library? That was the core issue. Then when production started going on digital, we started saying, okay, there's an opportunity towards production because everybody started going towards MAM. And now when the world has started distributing to tons of OTT platforms, the problem is shifted on the OTT side.
Yeah.
Right. So if I had like one monolithic architectural product, that was impossible for us to move on to each of these, and we had to jump wagons as the demand is. So I feel that this would not be possible without that. But I feel it, to your point, Chris, I don't think it's just beneficial to the vendors. The need arises from the customer, and we support it. And of course, then we had to innovate on this.
So being a realist, we could all for the rest of this session hold hands and sing Kumbaya and say what a wonderful world microservices is and everything's fantastic. But we advertise this panel as the good, the bad, and the ugly of microservices and media. So being realistic. So we talked about all the wonderful promise of microservices and media and what they could bring to us. In reality, where are we and what are some of the stumbling blocks that we're facing as an industry between where we are today and where we want to get in terms of the ultimate vision of being able to be vendor and platform independent and that sort of thing?
I have another joke. Well, it's not really a joke, it's just a statement. All problems in a microservice architecture can be solved by another microservice, unless, of course, the problem is too many microservices.
Oh my God. They get worse. They actually do get worse.
They do. We need that big hook. Somebody's got to hook them. Pull them out.
And so if I may add, one of the lowest common denominator in terms of issues where the microservices, I think, go through a bottleneck or they get throttled is the network communication. Because the moment you're talking about latency, you're talking about the transaction operations, etc. The more complex your microservices tend to get, depending on the workflow you're implementing. I think at some point in time, network does play a negative role, in terms of how it behaves and what happens then, right? So that's one of the issues which, at least I have seen in a bunch of implementations which we have gone across. And then data consistency, right? Think of it this way, that when you're looking at distributed applications, then the simultaneous transaction is something which is, again, a very difficult when you're actually looking at making things happen in the microservices. And that's something, again, which there are different ways to solve it. But again, if it's a complex ecosystem, then you have to, it's like, I think, resonating with Wes, that, sometimes you live with it and sometimes you can only solve partially some of these challenges. So that's something which I've seen, especially when we are looking at a little complex microservices-based ecosystem or workflows to be.
Well, one of the things too I'd add is that we alluded to it before. If you don't have standardization of APIs, then it's not a best of breed, and you can't just swap out one microservice for another. So you don't have that sort of ability to choose. You have to rewrite, maybe your workflow templates to now accept a new service. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if that's bad or ugly or which it is, but it's not good.
It's maybe
I think that right now there's probably a lot of ugly in the fact that just some challenges that if you're working with public cloud, right, the challenges of a cross-platform and how they handle certain bits of data. And this is where Mike is alluding to. They just need to work. It needs to feel like the their nirvana of plug and play. That it doesn't matter if I'm AWS, Azure, Google. If I'm talking to one bit of data over here on Azure, interacting with content sitting on AWS, but my hosted platform is Google. We just want them to play nice together. But there's a lot of translation that needs to take place. And I've said for a long time, the biggest problem with cloud computing right now is time. And not only time of getting things developed, but time within your operating environment to guarantee time, because there's an expectation within that environment of frame accuracy and control and so forth. And when you're dealing across different geographical regions that your content could be stored across with connectivity issues, guaranteeing certain time down to the frame, down to the millisecond, is much more difficult when the world is your oyster, as opposed to just this box, and guaranteeing within even a network in a single building, and so forth. But now you have all of these other variables that's in play. The other thing that I just want to mention and throw it back to the group is that there's some inherent differences of how software reacts within cloud computing platform versus an OS platform. And it just doesn't behave the same in that object store type data. For example, one thing that we are used to in the world when we went to digital files is being able to record in, let's say, record in a show, baseband recording that in, and then 5 seconds later, be playing it out in a delayed fashion. That's much more difficult in a cloud computing environment. So there are some requirements that the industry has expected that are not as easily handled. And there's a lot of smart people trying to figure some of these things out.
And I think that raises a good point, Shawn, of, why can't we just take things that have been done in other industries in terms of microservices and just apply them to media? And I think part of the answer is what you're talking about there. We are special. We do have unique requirements, and timing is one of them. I think file sizes and bandwidth is another one that are very unique to our business. And so we can't necessarily just take something that's already been invented for another business and port it over to media. We have unique challenges that we need to overcome.
Yeah, and then I'll echo with that. I mean, I'm going to tie, Shawn and Mike's statement and yours. That see, one of the challenges which we have seen is at the micro level. Forget about the at the systems level, right? But when you're talking about code development, etc., debugging of microservices systems is very dependent on the developer's experience with the systems. So it's very, very localized to a large extent, and their understanding of the systems or similar failure cases, etc. So it makes it challenging to either standardize such behaviors. And to your point, it could be very industry specific, but transporting from one to another may not necessarily be the best solutions in most of the time.
I'd add too to Shawn's statement that microservices certainly are cloud native, but you can run microservices on premise if you need low latency applications. So those things are still possible too.
Correct.
Absolutely.
Correct. And I think a number of people are looking at hybrid environments when it's real-time requirements. So I think probably what we'll see in our evolution is a lot more discussion around hybrid environments and standardization around that than full lift and shift, and I'm changing entire environments. That time factor is a real real difficult one to solve. And of course, the financial industry has that, and they've been on cloud for a while. Blockchain was their, solution in solving that. But will blockchain work in a real time, environment with large data structures? That's really the thing that we're figuring out today. So it is a little bit of that. We've loaded up the wagons. We're told that we can go put a stake in the ground somewhere out west, and there's a lot of chaos that's happening.
Yeah. Wes, I see your camera's off, but are you still with us?
He's at the bar. He's working on a new joke or something.
He is 3 pints in.
One thing that, and I'll let him jump in if he wants to, or the rest of us can do it. But in keeping this discussion lively and entertaining, one thing we had talked about in preparation for this call is there a danger? Is there a concern that people get too tied in to particular platforms and become vulnerable? Their operations become vulnerable as a result. And the example I think that Wes had raised in our prep call on this was the Parler example, where AWS decided to shut down Parler, and and we're not going to talk about politics or the rightness or the wrongness of that, but they were able to say, hey, we're shutting you down, you're not running anymore. And because they were so married to AWS, they kind of, their business was at risk. Is there risk for us? Not that any of us are running anything like that, social media network or anything, but in getting too married to one particular platform. How is that applicable to us? Is that important?
I think if you look at Parler, again, not talking about the politics of it, as a content provider and a platform where content can be made public. They had an agreement, contractual agreement with AWS, that if there's a break of this agreement, they have a 30-day window in order to exit the house and wake up somewhere else. And that's a reasonable, expectation of any business. If I'm leasing an office somewhere and they said, we just sold a business, you got 30 days to get out. Well, that's going to be a pain in the rear, but I can make that happen. In this particular case, they said, we don't like what your content is doing, so you have 24 hours. Now, if you're petabytes of data in our media and entertainment realm, if you're, ABC and you just ran a story against Jeff Bezos, I'm not saying that they're that petty, and it's not even close in comparison, but I'm just saying, and they have all of their eggs in the AWS basket, and they said, you know what, we're done. 24 hours, you have to exit and wake up somewhere else. That is absolutely impossible. I can't even get a fiber truck running over to the AWS center to try to do the entire dump and what do they call that, snowball or whatever, that you just move things over from one to the, it's like, that's impossible. I'm stuck. So there is this element of security that I think is the scariest word in the room on a number of levels that you have to consider as you're architecting moving forward.
And that's why you build hybrid type facilities. And you mentioned that before. You do a little bit on-prem, you protect yourself, and same thing you do with power, right? You buy power from the grid, but you have a generator backup. You got a UPS at home. We all learned about having UPSs at home when we started working from home. So you protect your business, and looks like they didn't really do that, or they didn't think they needed to.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, absolutely something that we all need to consider, and I think if there are solutions that can be architected that are platform and agnostic, that's another place we want to ultimately be, right?
I just think it has to, that security of your business and your product has to be foremost in your mind when you're architecting anything. I mean, over the past 15, maybe 20 years, as we've moved to more commodity environment on-prem that's network enabled, we've been subject to hackers, and we've had to rethink, security. IT all of a sudden was the guys, fixing printers. And now all of a sudden it's like, holy crap, we got people changing Chiron on the air, and, crawls and so forth. What do we do? So, those type of security concerns, for example, Sony, large hack several years ago of their content. Where was that? That was in the cloud. And as much as you want to say that their security people are working on it and they're smart hackers. And so you have to think about all these variables and make sure that your content as a media and entertainment provider, that's your money, that's your eggs in the basket. And how am I going to protect it long term?
Yeah, I think to Shawn's point, I mean, that is definitely the ugly part of the microservices, because the more and more you split your, let's say, logic layer or the middle tier into multiple services, your attack surface is increasing phenomenally, right? And so which means that your vulnerability to get penetrated or attacked by some ransomware or something is going to be very high. And if you look at IP-based streaming, you are adding the devices, which means the hardware, right? And more you're opening up your communication ports with different hardware. You are also making them vulnerable to attacks. So I think with all these devices proliferating in the media business as well, I think our ability to create I'm just throwing as an example a zero trust model, essentially, to build these kind of ecosystem is imperative, but it's very challenging. And I think this is where most of the organizations are going to struggle with the continuation of non-standardization of these issues. And then another vector which is coming into the picture is privacy. With privacy coming into the picture, it is really, really disrupting the advertisement market. So going back to the point that, how do you collect data, how do you process data, etc. All these things are going to lead to significant proliferation of microservices. Because microservices is your answer for a lot of flexibility you're looking for, but then you're proliferating so much that your ability to contain the environment and make it within the security zone of your desire, I think that's going to be a challenge, a big challenge for the industry.
And just to add to that, because of these reasons, Mike raised a very valid point that there is no standardization in microservices. But just as an example, I mean, for any vendor to pass through Disney's security clearance to be a part of their IT system is a massive task. And with what is available in the market today, you cannot just pass it. So like Sujay was saying, unless you have this a zero trust environment there where people are really hyperactive on the security aspects, there's no way that vendors will switch over to those integrations, and customers would not have a choice to be able to choose and pick and choose different services, because these aspects around security and privacies take over, and then it just makes it impossible there. So yeah, that's the ugly part. Even within the organization, and I think Sujay alluded to one such point, microservices is not for everyone. It's not for every software team. I mean, a great example is, I think Sujay did mention about the debugging of it, right? It's not something which everybody understands. So just to create, I mean, a wish list would be to have a microservices enabled architecture, but just to have it, you need to do a lot more within the teams as well to make it a reality and make it truly, microservices architect. So the challenges are both on the external side and on the internal side, and hence the bad and the ugly are on both sides, right? Is what is increasingly coming out to.
And so on the bad and ugly side, I've got a joke. Maybe that'll make a mess up as well.
I
But
can't wait.
and it's not mine, and I'm going to paraphrase it because I don't have the exact quote in front of me. But one of my favorite quotes about microservices was a tweet by somebody who said, we went to a microservices architecture so that every system outage could be more like a murder mystery.
No kidding. That is so true.
And I think that's great. But that's one of the things you need to consider is that, when we look back at the old monolithic systems we had, there were a finite number of connection points that could fail, right? And if something failed, you could say, okay, it's this connection. In Shawn's case, it's the traffic and automation connection broke, and I'm not getting my schedules, for instance. But when you go to a microservice based architecture, you could be dealing with hundreds or thousands of different points of potential failure.
Well, that's where orchestration comes in, and the orchestration management of all that can bubble up where the error is. Although I will give you credit for the best joke. That was better than any of those.
I can't claim authorship, but that's why it was good, Mike. All right. Why don't we open the floor to questions here? I mean, 50 minutes is woefully insufficient to really talk about microservices at any level of depth. But hopefully we tried to touch on some of the high points and, kind of the good, the bad, and the ugly as it relates to our media and broadcasting business. But I'd just like to open the floor up if anybody on the line here has some points they want to raise or some questions. We've got a really diverse panel here, and I'd love to hear your questions.
We left him speechless.
Jeff, you're on mute if you're speaking.
Yeah,
I've had 2 glasses of wine. Sorry, guys. So as we are in the media industry and we're exchanging a lot of high bandwidth flows between different solutions, and obviously in microservices we're potentially granularizing that further. I was just wondering from the panel, I mean, of the microservices that you've currently built, are you actually exchanging full bandwidth uncompressed flows between microservices? And if you are you going through an intermediate like 2110, or are you doing it via methods like DMA?
Yeah, I think Mike can answer some of that in his workflow.
Yeah, well, that's a real tough question. We hope to be able to do something like that. So we're in the process of designing a new facility. We're hoping that some of that can be achieved. Whether it's uncompressed, that may be a bit of a challenge. Certainly some compressed formats would lend it a little bit easier to do that sort of thing, but then you got to worry about the codec. So, these are challenges, but this, I think if you look in the future and you get out your crystal ball, that's where things are going. And that's how, facilities are going to be. They're going to be software defined, and everything is going to likely work like that eventually. So I think that's what the promise is. And what we're talking about here are the building blocks to get there.
Yeah, and if I can add to that, Jeff, I can't reveal the details, but I can tell you that we are dealing with a scenario where there's a video compression workload which has a certain component which is CPU intensive, and there's a certain component which is GPU intensive. And we are leveraging microservices to solve that problem, essentially. So the answer is yes, there are companies who have certain work-intensive workloads. They are leveraging microservices to solve some of these issues at the hardware level as well.
And the reality is, with uncompressed video, unless you just have a massive budget, you're not going to be playing uncompressed video out of the cloud. So in reality, that's why 2110 is working on all the compression standards, because they understand that it's got to translate all the way through, including cloud computing environment, in order to control and play out. So compression is going to be the nature when we're talking about cloud, workflows, video flows.
Yeah, you look at AWS with their CDI announcements, and I'm sure interested to see applications where there are real-time workflows in AWS using CDI, and how to get cloud to ground, ground to cloud. There's the VSF is looking at those sorts of standardizing those workflows too.
That's right.
So, and this is you're building towards a hybrid infrastructure at that point. Some on-prem, some off-prem.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think that opens up an interesting question of what do we consider a CDI to direct memory access decode as being a microservice in its own right that might then would have to go back into another encapsulator before it could go back into CDI. And it's at what point do we be a microservice versus a macro service of microservices that actually resemble a product? How granular do we get in terms of interoperability between different functions and potentially different vendors?
Well, I think we're still very much in the early stages of figuring a lot of this stuff out. I mean, we're really.
I think my internet connection is. Yeah.
We're really about a decade in of replacing iron boxes in a rack with commodity boxes, off the shelf, and now looking at cloud. So we've taken in the past 15 years at least this radical shifting of technology, even from coax cables to Ethernet cables, and that jump over to the IP transmission. And we're still figuring things out there. So when your monitor goes dark in an IP environment, it's almost like that microservice joke, it's a murder mystery. Where did it lose packets? And maybe somebody plugged in that grabbed the IP address of a device that's already on, we're still trying to figure those things out as an industry, and we're automatically evolving, to something else to figure out. So in that respect, it's very, very exciting. But the reality is, in the old days, it's like, hey, I don't want to be your beta tester. Well, the whole industry now are alpha testers. I've just got to say that now. I mean, that's the truth.
Yeah, and I'm glad, Jeff, that you brought up the term macro service, because that's actually a topic that, by another name, we're actually dealing with in the OSA right now. Is that microservices are all well and good, but they don't really accomplish what you need to accomplish on their own. They accomplish a little bit of it, and so you need jobs or macro services to group them together to actually accomplish something useful in a standardized way. And so that's absolutely something that needs to be tackled and addressed, and I think standardized if there's any hope for this to work across vendors and across platforms.
I wonder if some companies are going to want a hybrid solution and have parts of it such that if you lose the internet connection to the cloud services, that what's still running in on premises keeps your business going, so you can suffer internet outages.
It kind of goes back to the resiliency that we were talking about earlier, right? That things are going to fail. How do you bounce back? How do you recover from those? I think that was a great point.
Yeah, I think you got to architect around the minimum amount that you need, and the minimum you could still make money with and survive and do your workflow, and then you can grow into the cloud. I mean, the cloud is the premise of expandability and flexibility, and you expand into it. So I think that's what probably the future of hybrid type facilities look like.
All right, good questions. Any other questions from our audience here?
I think Robin, he messaged me earlier, so I'll mention that he's having some internet connectivity issues in the chat. But he mentioned about ingress and egress of moving files around in the cloud. It's a little bit like, with dealing with public cloud environments. They're a little bit like the old commercial of the Roach Motel. They go in, but they don't come out. We make it real cheap to go in, but we make it real expensive to go out. So that's a consideration that you've, especially in editing. Don't move your content into a cloud environment if you're going to touch it 1,000 times a day. It's like you're gonna spin up your cost like crazy. So your final archive copies, go into the bucket. Your raw copies keep around, or just make data pointers and render it in the cloud. There's creative ways to do that.
And that's a perfect use case for IMF and some of the services that we've created for that, right? Is
Absolutely
you have
IMF
content, and you just use IMF to slice and dice it virtually.
Absolutely.
So I'd just like to thank everybody for your time, and hope you all enjoyed our program, and special thanks to all of our panelists who have